Okay, and welcome to today's PR webinar with Pete Pachal, Mashable's tech editor, which we're very fortunate to have. So, Pete, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, thanks, Dennis. Pleasure to be here.
Pete, we have about 45 minutes, a lot of eager folks listening in, so let's just jump right into it. Can you tell us a little about yourself and your professional background?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I'm at Mashable now. I'm the tech editor here. I've been doing tech at Mashable for 5+ years now. Um, I got started into this whole internet thing, I guess, um probably around 2005. Before that, I was kind of had a previous life as a magazine editor. And while I was sort of getting rapidly bored at, I think, Enthusiast magazine, nothing wrong with the magazine, but it just wasn't challenging me anymore. I was looking around for stuff and applied for a job at the Sci-Fi Channel, which sounded cool to me because I liked sci-fi shows. And then they thought, you know what, you'd be great for this tech blog we're doing. And of course, this is 2005, so this is when tech blogs were the thing to be starting. And yeah, so they hired me to do that, which was awesome, and it was great to be in charge of this tech site for a major company and kind of write about all the stuff I had been thinking about and writing about to a lesser extent at magazines, which was like iPods and gadgets and cell phones. And I did that for a while. The blog, by the way, was called device.com, DVICE, and it no longer exists as a standalone thing. It was sort of merged into Blaster, which then became Sci-Fi Wire, I think just earlier this year. And but it was super fun to do. We covered all kinds of technology, especially design and gadgets. And it was certainly a great time to be running a gadget blog, no matter what you were doing. There was, obviously the iPhone came out at that time, apps, accessories, gadgets. I was living that 24/7, and then ultimately decided to leave and move on to sort of a place that was a little less TV focused because they just Sci-Fi and NBC Universal, obviously the primary focus there is TV shows, and sort of wanted to do someplace more focused on content. So I went to PC Mag for a year, and that was an interesting place. I'll leave it at that. And then just decided that it wasn't really what I was looking to do. I was running the news division there, but it's a site that is not really focused on news. It's like CNET, PC Mag is very much focused on reviews, and it's a fine business model. Totally works for them. Just wasn't the focus I was looking for. And but what happened was Mashable was sort of rapidly expanding at the time. This was 2011, and they were a very horizontal model. They were sort of an old school blog, and they were looking to sort of become more vertical, like having real verticals of like business and science and technology. And so they need someone to run their tech vertical, and I was like, I can do that. And it has been a great fit ever since. Mashable obviously has grown a lot since I came here. It's changed in many ways, but through it all, it's had a great culture. It's had a great outlook on especially how it covers tech. And yeah, I'm really honestly super psyched to be here and looking forward to the next several years here, just because it's been we have a good solid plan and a good solid foundation.
And that's an interesting evolution going from a traditional magazine then to television with some internet to, as you mentioned, a service that's a media company that's really more focused on reviews to sort of more, I don't know, long form, well, I don't know about long form journalism, but longer form. I was reading on Wikipedia, today is Mashable's 12th birthday, so congratulations to all
Thank
of
you.
you.
I heard that from you. It's like funny. Like I do believe we did something on the 10th anniversary a few years back, or a couple of years back, I guess. Um, and now we didn't do much. It was like a cake or something, and Pete Cashmore made a few comments. But now it's honestly like I don't think anyone knows but you and me, Dennis. And as soon as I'm done this webinar, I'm going right to Pete Cashmore's office and just high-five it up and maybe take some credit for thinking of it if you don't mind.
Go right ahead. Hey, everybody needs to look good in front of somebody, right? No, I'm just kidding. I mean, really is exciting, and honestly, I mean, to the tech community, I mean, you guys are a product of the internet, and you joined not at the very beginning of the adventure, but it sounds like quite early, frankly. I mean, even there's been so many shifts, and I mean, how you kind of got into it with your own history and how Mashable eventually, you know, got verticals. But how would you say that Mashable over the past 12 years, what's been the big shift in Mashable? How is Mashable different today from what Mashable once was?
Yeah, big. I could go on for a while there. I'll try to keep it semi-short. But the biggest change, the thing that defined Mashable, and this was before I got here, was when Pete and his few writers decided to focus on social media, both as the topic they were covering and the way they would reach their readers. So at the time, Twitter and Facebook, it's hard to remember this time, they were very new. And there wasn't really anyone dedicated to covering them. So, and the networks were at this point rapidly expanding. So Pete had the perhaps obvious in hindsight, but genius idea of like, well, if we dedicate ourselves to writing about these topics, and you know, the people on these networks, which are growing like wildfire, may want to actually read them, share them, and we may grow rapidly because of that as well. And it worked. It worked like magic. I mean, like gangbusters. So Mashable, to my knowledge, was the only company that that really did that in a very focused kind of way. I mean, obviously, a lot of media companies grew out of the social media age, but you know, so it's something Mashable did, and I don't think any company could ever really do again. It's like an impossible sort of perfect storm to replicate, at least as far as social media is concerned. But that is what led to the rapid expansion. And it wasn't just Facebook and Twitter. It was like consuming, and this honestly is a philosophy that still is part of our DNA today, that when there is a new network, when there is a new thing out there that people are doing, whether it's Pinterest, Instagram stories, Snapchat, what have you, we're going to jump on it. We're going to do it, consume it, be on that platform to reach whoever's there. And, you know, regardless, you know, it may peter out, it may be the next big thing, but regardless, we're going to be there on the ground floor. And that's always, you know, driven us since the early days of Facebook and Twitter. Now, of course, you have every other media company has learned the lesson of Mashable and is doing the same thing. So it's harder today, much harder, to sort of just latch yourself onto a network and grow, but it's still generally a good idea as long as you have the resources.
That makes sense, and I mean, you guys are often at the forefront of it. I remember opening, I don't know, Meerkat or one of the other live streaming apps, which were really, really popular, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and you guys were all over it. I mean, it is a good approach, and it obviously makes sense. For example, nowadays YouTubers are big. Who knows if you guys are covering it or not, but yeah, what a perfect storm. Can you tell us, what does your team look like as far as full-time members, freelancers, content syndication? How does all of that work in the tech section?
Yeah, in the tech vertical, it's roughly 10 people plus or minus an intern or two. So I have a deputy also here in New York. I've got a senior tech correspondent, a couple of reporters, and a couple of reporters out west. And then there's our chief correspondent, who isn't technically part of the tech vertical, but he tends to write about tech. That's Lance Ulanoff. And we have a couple of people scattered around the world in our bureaus. So we have now bureaus in London, Sydney, and Singapore. And in each one of those offices, there's kind of a tech person. And we even have a guy in Croatia, even though that's not an official bureau. And he's very tech-minded. So like in the greater tech team in Nashville is probably like 15. but technically in my vertical, it's about 10. Though it's, one of the things about Mashable is that we cover what we see, like basically the intersection of tech, entertainment, and culture. So even, we have other verticals, including science and business, but to some extent, every story on Mashable kind of intersects tech in some way. It's just sort of the tech stories tend to be the ones that are more about the tech than about the story. So like, for example, something blows up on Twitter, whatever it may be. Donald Trump Jr. releases the emails, for example. I mean, that's a Mashable story, even though it's sort of a general hard news story. But one, yes, the releasing of the emails is a story, but the Mashable angle on that story is going to be different from CNN. So, and we did a few stories out of that one, but I'll give you my take on what sort of the perfect Mashable story was on the Don Jr. emails. Is like we did a story that was basically said, yes, the emails came out, but what the real scandal is the email signature here, which is absolutely terrible. Which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I mean, it's one of those things where it's that sort of knowing, digital savvy play on sort of major news is kind of, I think, what separates sort of a Mashable story from what you would see on CNN or USA Today, and that usually is like some tech angle to that, and sort of yeah, the tech channel sometimes takes those stories, sometimes they don't, but it's I hope that gives you a sense of a little more of the flavor of what we look for.
Absolutely. I mean, it is really interesting. And you're right that, I mean, anybody can take a general story and regurgitate it, but it's amazing to know yourselves and your audience well enough to know what a Mashable take on the story is. And at the same time, Pete, I should stop for a sec. Audience members, if you have any questions for Pete, once we're done with a few more questions here, we're going to take your questions. I see them coming in. Just keep sending your questions, and we'll try to take as many at the end. With that, Pete, you mentioned you have a few bureaus with London, Australia, and Singapore, and then a person in Croatia who isn't really a bureau, but obviously is physically there. At this point, it sounds like all of Mashable's content is in English, and I kind of have a two-part question. First is, do you see you guys going into other languages to become even more global? And the other question is, tech used to be very Silicon Valley focused, so obviously there was tech elsewhere and in Asia and so on, but now we feel it more with the socials and just being so interconnected and startups popping up all over the world. I mean, how do you guys cover that properly now that it's so decentralized? And at the same time, just the question about languages, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's a tough question, so I'll take the first one first. We don't translate stuff yet, but we are interested in partnerships that will. So we already have one that exists in France, and Mashable partners with FR24, and their content is all in French, obviously. And so their version of Mashable France both does original stories and translates some of our stories. So it's really an entirely different edition over there, even though some of the content is translated. We're interested in doing more of that. So far, the France partnership has been good, but it sort of has to make some strategic sense in that, do we have an existing audience there in some form? Or if we don't, do we have reason to believe that there is an audience there that will respond to the kind of content we're doing? So, and there's other considerations too in terms of local laws. Like we also have Mashable India, Um, that I didn't list as one of the bureaus because of the laws there. You can't really operate a foreigner can't really operate a media company there, so everyone has to sort of contract it out, and it tends to be sort of the same pool of freelancers. So the quality doesn't vary a lot, and the people kind of move around from within the sort of freelance community there. So you'll notice we'll have probably a bunch of video stories for a couple of months, and then it gets very silent. Um, so yeah, we're interested in certainly expanding. It just has to make a lot of sense, and it's certainly like just easier to find an English-speaking place that has a certain. We probably already have a certain amount of traffic already, and sort of just figuring out a bureau and how to sort of adapt our existing content. But we're definitely interested in more translation.
Right.
The second part of startups emigrating from Silicon Valley and sort of how to cover it properly. We're guided mostly, like that's true. I think that's true to a certain extent. And I would also counter, though, I do think Silicon Valley and the stuff coming out of there, like they've responded to that intense competition, and the quality of stuff coming out of Silicon Valley in the news tends to be better than ever. So it's still a hard gravitational pull to resist. But honestly, we just look at what are people talking about. Like what are people talking about locally or in this community, either on Twitter or some other network, and is it a phenomenon that's on our radar, sort of one way or the other? And if it is, then or is the startup addressing a phenomenon that is local to that area, or is a problem other people haven't solved? That's kind of our barometer, like rather than sort of just oh, I'm an interesting startup out of, I don't know, Zimbabwe. It's like, that's great, but what are you seeing as, like, we don't have a big audience in Zimbabwe? What is the problem you're solving that our audience cares about? Or what part of our audience is now already talking about this, and we need to pay attention? That's kind of the metrics that we would look at first.
Okay. And let's talk about content planning. How does content planning work in your vertical? Do you use an editorial calendar? How does that come together?
Yeah, I get asked about editorial calendars a lot. Not that a lot, but like fairly often, as a course of doing business. I wouldn't say we don't have one, but we generally don't. What we do have a calendar of events that is like the tech calendar. So there's an Apple event in September. There's probably another one in October. There's all these other tech events, from CES to Mobile World Congress to there's a Samsung release sometime in the spring, and we can kind of plan around those. And then there's just the general calendar of like, oh yeah, we'll do something for holiday. We'll do year-end stuff. So those are all fairly predictable. And I wish I could say we were a little more interesting in that. Oh yeah, we've got all this other stuff planned. But as a news site, we tend to follow the news cycle. We tend to go deeper on those bigger trends. So if, for example, Uber is in a lot, this past spring, Uber got a lot of bad press. And if we see our audience responding to that particular trend, that particular news cycle, like, we're going to go deep on it. Is that a thing that we can plan? You can't really plan it months out, but once a trend that big takes hold, you can start planning weeks out. And so you kind of go, okay, we really want to own this story. Let's assign out a couple of longer pieces and plan them for a few weeks in a month out. But generally, like, we're pretty boring. It's like the tech calendar and the calendar. That's generally that'll tell you about 70 or 80% of like the focus that we'll have.
So roughly, if you had to guess, how many pitches a day do you get? And connected with that question, how can PR professionals on the line and around the world be the most helpful to you and your team?
Yeah, good question. I've never counted, but I do know, like, basically the Gmail inbox will show you like 50 messages, I guess, on the front page. So Usually, if I don't touch my inbox from sort of morning till night, I'll be like the last email from the beginning will be 2 pages in. So I guess I would say roughly I get 100 meals a day, and probably of those, 60 or 70 are probably unsolicited pitches. Um, well, and not. I mean, pitches in the general sense. That's a wide net I'm casting because some are very like general, like this is going on, and I'm just blasting it out. And maybe half of those, so maybe 20 to 30 of those are like genuine, oh, I'm sending this email specifically to Pete Pachal, and, I want him to write about my thing or assign it out. And of those, I would say not a lot are really crafted to Mashable or taking into account the Mashable voice and audience. And I don't do this, and I wouldn't do this anyway because it's just rude. But every now and then you see someone on social media, like a reporter, slamming like PR people for not doing like basic homework on a pitch. And I get it. We're all busy and whatever. I wouldn't do that, but I would say those people kind of generally have a point. I mean, there is unfortunately, the pitches are very rarely crafted that well. And I get the calculus that's happening on the other side. You're like, well, even if I do craft a great pitch, sometimes I don't even get a response, or or they're not going to do it anyway. So you go for the shotgun approach. But I mean, the shotgun, I mean, it becomes the spam equation. One, you're not going to, and I'm not trying to equate, pitches with spam. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just sort of like, if you're blasting things out, it becomes a pure numbers game, and you're like, okay, a certain percentage of, editors will do this, and I might get a certain amount of return. And I just don't think that's a winning strategy. I don't think it's a long-term strategy, and I don't think it's giving you a good name out there. Like no one's ever happy to hear from someone who has a reputation for not doing careful pitches. So yes, I understand doing a careful pitch, taking into account previous stories, the area of coverage of the site, the person. It does take time, and you probably won't, pay off on the first one or two or even the first six. But I mean, eventually, like, if you get enough of those, like, something will click. And even if they don't, the editor will always at least read your pitch, even if they might not respond.
It's interesting what you're saying about just the generic blast. We had Nikki Eckstein, the travel editor of Bloomberg, a couple weeks ago, who is probably, if you're in luxury travel, I mean, there's nobody better to cover what you're doing. And she was saying similar numbers. It really is surprising how frequent just sort of the generic blast occurs to people who you really don't want to be generic with because they have such a great audience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I again, like from a number standpoint, I kind of get it. Like if you don't really care, so like of course it'd be great if Mashable wrote about your thing, or a bigger site. I mean, but if you blast out enough stuff, like sure, some guy Joe's blog who was really just looking to establish himself as whatever might just write about your thing. But I mean, what's the value of that in the long term? And there's so many sort of dime a dozen sites. And honestly, like I think the currency of those has gone down a bit. I mean, like ever since media companies, I wouldn't say hit bottom, but things were looking pretty bleak about a year and a half ago. Traffic had taken a downturn. Facebook changed its algorithm, and it sort of became very apparent industry-wide that scale was finite. You couldn't just keep cranking out more content and expecting more audience. And I think in the last year and a half, the biggest change in media has been acknowledging that it's like, and it's a really simple equation, and it's just, quality over quantity. That's not to say we're never going to reblog or aggregate or, whatever you want to call it, but it is going to be like, concentrating on other things on your plate than just sort of the candy and the free stuff and the easy high calorie traffic. And of course, the other major change has been video, and that's a whole nother can of worms.
Speaking of video, how are you guys tackling video if you are?
We are extensively. So yeah, video has changed a lot in the past, I mean, honestly, 10, 12 years. I mean, video has been on the internet almost as long as there's been an internet. But really the changes over the last couple of years with the rise of live video, especially on Facebook, and sort of the rise of these snackable videos, for lack of a better term. But I think video got, I'll just say platforms like Facebook and Twitter and all the social platforms, which we occasionally call distributed here in the media world. All those platforms got good at video and started putting them prominently in their algorithms. Specifically, Facebook probably was the biggest example there. Excuse me. So once that happened, that video, there was no avoiding it. Everyone had to do video, and if you weren't, you were out of the game. I mean, you basically, your edge rank would suffer, and any site that couldn't do it in some form was not going to be able to sort of get the time spent, all the metrics that you want to go after. So we have a pretty extensive video team. We've organized them into a group called Mashable Studios, and they have multiple duties. So one of the big things is doing distributed video, but also tailoring that video to the platform. So a Facebook video will look very different from a YouTube video, will probably look different, not entirely different, from an Instagram video, but certainly a bit different, and this is arguably not even video, but different from, say, an Instagram story or a Snapchat story. But what all those what all those elements have in common, all those platforms have in common, it's video in some form, and a traditional like editor / reporter, isn't enough, not nearly enough. I mean, you need either that person to have skills in editing and shooting, more editing than the shooting, or a team. And we've assembled our own video team. It's fairly extensive. They do things for all these platforms. And the biggest shift there for sites themselves, I think, because it's distributed, the audience is so huge, that's been like the biggest change has been the focus shifting from video on your site to video on distributed platforms. So before you even start a video now, you have to decide, is it going on Facebook? Is it going on YouTube? Where's this going? Because that will dictate exactly what you put in the video and the style of the video. I mean, all those snackable videos on Facebook, we all know what a Facebook video looks like now, right? I mean, it's like a minute and a half, punches you in the face with visuals right off the bat, and it has captions and sort of an audio track. There's very rarely any kind of talking head, if ever. And that's starting to change a little bit. I'm seeing more like people trying to experiment out of that box, but I mean, you have to be able to tell your story in that format before you even start. You can't just go like, oh, we're writing about whatever, the iPhone 8, and just be like, yeah, let's do a video on this because that'd be nice because we want to do video. And it's like it's way more focused than that now. Because I think honestly, like 2 or 3 years ago, it was that. It was like, all right, let's throw a video on this post and hope some people watch it and reap some revenue with either our ad network or tying it into like Brightcove or JW Player or whatever, Uyala or all these other players that help you monetize video.
It's interesting what you're saying, which is basically make video specific, not so much specific to the platform, but catered to it a little bit. And it's interesting because, I have some close friends who make a living as YouTubers, very, very big professional YouTubers. And it's interesting because these folks get it, and you guys obviously get it. So when you go to their video, as you said, on Facebook, it's different from what's on YouTube, from what's on Instagram, from what's on other platforms, whereas it feels like companies are getting it, but very slowly starting to understand that you can't just put out the same video on different platforms and expect the same results.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can, you just lose, and it'll also what'll happen if you do that, it's going to dilute your following on that platform. You know, it's going to hurt you. You know, people on that platform will wonder, well, what is Mashable or whatever. You pick your brand on YouTube if you're just feeding us, you know, these videos that don't really fit. Yeah, YouTube is an entirely different strategy for us, where it's much more show-based, franchise-based. It's episodic. There's a lot more freedom to do different formats, but once you sort of pick a format for a particular franchise, you stick with it, and that's how you build an audience there. And it's tough. YouTube's, you know, there's a lot of competition on YouTube, but if you hit on the right sort of combination of things, the right personality, and you stick with it for, you know, several months at least, you can carve out a following there.
It absolutely is competitive, and it seems to be taking over the world, which is amazing considering YouTube's been around forever, but good for them. So one more question, audience members, if you have any more questions, they're coming in, but keep sending them in. We'll try to get through them. Pete, a question I did want to ask you, because we do have a number of startups on the line, is, and I'm sure they're wondering, dear God, Pete, how do we get our startup into Mashable? How do you cover our launch? What can we do to compete with Google and YouTube and Facebook and everybody else who's in Uber and all these big players for a little bit of attention?
Yeah, I've never heard that question before. No, it's a tough nut to crack. So honestly, like what I tend to sort of lead with in this is a little bit of bad news, where it's like if you just want sort of a one-off article, and I know these are kind of like feathers in the cap, and you kind of want to have, but a one-off article about your service that, you know, takes one of my reporters an hour or two to write, and is just sort of hey, here's this startup doing this thing. There's not a lot of value in that, both for me and you, frankly. Maybe you think it is valuable to you. Maybe if you have a good case why it is. And again, that's great if it is, but I mean, it's still not very valuable to me and sort of our audience, because ultimately, whatever your startup story is has to be put in some kind of context that matters to, you know, the topics that my audience cares about. And you know, essentially, you've got to tell that story somehow. Sometimes it's, you know, top lining it in sort of an elevator pitch or a tweet pitch that's like, hey, I've got this thing. And then, by the way, sorry, that's not an invite to pitch me on Twitter, because that's probably not the best thing. But like, I'm just sort of talking about brevity. Like, you kind of need to like make sure that story is told very quickly in either the email subject or, you know, the first paragraph. A very short paragraph. I feel like a lot of startups and people want to tell their whole story and like, hey, you know, read this whole email to be worth it. Read the whole story. Sorry, I'm not going to do that. But mostly like, show me why I'm an idiot for not even knowing about it, or not knowing you already. You know, like show me that you're connected, that you're, you know, authority in whatever area you're operating in, and why, you know, sort of Mashable's audience will tend to care about that area, or you, or your opinion, or, you know, whatever you're up to. Tell me about, maybe it's an investor who is known or known to invest in interesting things, or tell me the problem you're solving. Like, I mean, it's really like, tell me a story, but do it in a very efficient manner. And again, like, if there were a magic formula to that, I would just tell you to do it. I'll tell you some things to avoid, which is like, don't pitch me on Facebook. I don't accept pitches on Facebook. That could be a personal thing, but I think most reporters are kind of like that. LinkedIn and Twitter are fine to pitch me on, but please tailor your pitch to the medium. Like, I've gotten a lot of pitches on Twitter and I have my DMs are open, so like a lot of people tend to pitch me there. But I've gotten a lot of pitches on Twitter that are really literally like copied and pasted emails into like a Twitter DM, and it sort of makes me rue the day Twitter ever like opened up the character count there. But it's also just like it's not very savvy. It's like tailor your pitch to Twitter. Twitters are short. Twitter's actually not the worst way to get my attention. It's just that I would almost scroll through my DMs the way I scroll through my newsfeed. Like, hit me with a photo, some interesting thing in the first sentence. Make sure your pitch is very, very short, and yeah, maybe it'll get some attention. But mostly, like I said, just tell a story and make sure that story is one sort of the Mashable audience will be interested in. And really, like, to get a sense of that, like, it's dumb, obvious advice, but like, go to the site, go to the text section, scroll around the stories, and if you don't think of your story as naturally fitting within those, I would say probably don't pitch me.
Right. Excuse me. And we have a few audience member questions in the remaining time. I just want to take those. The first question, Pete, is how would you define the Mashable voice/audience?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the audience I think of are anyone who is living their lives digitally. That's really it. Like anyone living their lives digitally today. It's like we're all living our lives constantly plugged in, constantly on our smartphones, constantly talking to Alexa, streaming Netflix, binging stuff. People who are immersed in that lifestyle, who kind of want to be more in the know than other people either in that lifestyle or don't live their lives as fully digitally, and sort of want to see that that way of living kind of affirmed, improved, enhanced in some way. And that doesn't mean simply adding on a bunch of gizmos. Sometimes it just means simplification. That there's fewer things. Like, don't show me the 20 things I need to wear to get whatever data or be as hip on the tech, so to speak, like tech in quotes, as everybody else. Show me the one thing. Show me the one perfect thing that'll do this for me. And often there isn't one, but like, cut to the heart of things, so that you can just optimize yourself, your life, especially the one that sort of you're living through your smartphone. That's kind of how I see the tech audience.
Okay, and we have another question, which is what kind of subject header will get you to open an email? Is it safe to say, just like your last answer, get to the heart of things quickly?
Yeah, and also like you can cheat it a bit by like either tying into like a big Mashable tech topic. I mean, if it's not a natural connection, I wouldn't do it, and I'd probably see through it anyway. But like iPhone 8, for example, Snapchat, Instagram stories, Alexa, like these kinds of topics are kind of what our audience obsesses about, and they are obsessive. That's the one on-brand word I probably didn't use in our my description of the audience. Yeah, we like to think of our audience as like they're obsessing on these things that we're obsessing on, and I think it's a pretty accurate thing to say. So yeah, make sure, like, if you can get a reference to one of those things in there and it's not gratuitous and it's not unnatural, then get it in there. Because my audience will care if you we have the perfect tool for your Instagram stories, and it better be that. But don't say, oh yeah, well, I don't really have that, but I want you to talk to my CEO because he's an expert on Instagram stories. Click, block, trash. Don't like sell the crap out of your pitch, but sell it honestly. That's all.
You know what you were just saying about we're for obsessive folks, and I have your Twitter, the main Mashable Twitter open, and the bio is Mashable's for super fans. We're not for the casually curious obsessed with us. I mean, that's a pretty high level of consistency between what you're saying, what's on your Twitter. I mean, it's so obvious that part of your guys' success is just this consistency throughout your organizations. So congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
Um,
We've had good training, but also I think it's a very like we obviously you know researched it and worked it out, and I don't think we actually focus grouped it, but I mean we wanted to we spent some time on it because we wanted some branding that wasn't something that was like not like the branding came out last year, and we wanted something that reflected what we were doing already, but also let us chart a path and gave us more of a north star for any stories and big stories we were going to be doing in the future. So, and it's really worked out. I mean, because we obsess about lots of things in tech and culture and entertainment, and we just basically we codified it, and that's like so when we go deep on something, like we'll go deep, like we'll get in the weeds. We don't shy away from that. It's just we always come back out. So
mm.
especially with tech, because you can get in the weeds on so many things so quickly. Like, one example, chip technology. Like, I love to sort of sit down with Qualcomm and NVIDIA and chat about chips, but I'm not going to come out and write some story that's like NVIDIA's latest chip. NVIDIA latest unveils some latest chip. What I am going to write about is like the next gen of gaming is going to be mind blowing. Here's why. And then, that is the Mashable story on like a sort of a raw in the weeds tech story. Uh,
That's interesting. And Pete, we have about 5 minutes left, so without objection, I'll just throw out a few more questions. If we can do them kind of in a rapid fire way, that'd be great.
cool. Start the
Um,
clock.
just trying to be mindful of your time before anybody's really. So, and by the way, Pete, really, thank you so much for the time that you've given us today. I mean, you've been more than generous. You really have.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, so we have a quick question, which is where does the tech section end? Oh, that's a good question. Where does the tech section end and the business section begin?
Um, Geez, very good question. There's so much overlap. Tech would be tech story on, say, Twitter would be like, here's this new app feature, here's what it means, here's how to use it. The business story would be, um, here's Twitter's strategy and how they're getting there, and they're doing this new feature, and perhaps a little price to earnings and stock price stuff in there as well. So that's kind of like I hope that gives you more of a concrete example of sort of the difference, but that's generally the difference.
Absolutely. And okay, next question. Covering tech topics, what kind of big technology trends can you see or find interesting?
All of them. No. Um, I find AI and the rise of that and everything around it very interesting. I think the in the weed stuff on AI is incredibly dry, but the stuff it can do for you and more the promise of it is very, very interesting. So mostly that. Augmented reality, somewhat. I'm not entirely big on it like some others. I'm definitely not big on virtual reality because I think it requires too much of the wearer, and our audience figures on VR stories tend to show that our audience is kind of interested but not really that interested. Um, and yeah, anything like existential with like robots and jobs and that kind of stuff, that tends to be okay. Yeah.
Fair enough. And someone's asking, does Mashable ever take contributed content slash bylines?
We do less than we used to. It's more of a rare exception than a sort of a thing we seek out, which we might have been doing probably 3 or 4 years ago. But yeah, I would say pitch it, but don't have high hopes.
And Pete, before we wrap things up here, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, just generally, like the thing I was saying about pitches earlier, I would just sort of reiterate. I mean, I hope I was convincing in that, like, really, you don't want me to write a one-off on your startup. You know, what you want me to do is integrate your startup and your story into a bigger topic that my audience cares about. And if we can work together on that, then awesome. If whatever you're doing solves a problem that my audience is very concerned with, then awesome. But don't think, don't picture the single article one-off. Here's the startup doing something that might or might not be interesting as the goal. Have your goal be like part of the narrative.
Hmm. Have your goal be part of the narrative. Um, Pete, just to kind of wrap things up, I'd like to quickly thank you on behalf of our small team here at Max Vangeli Digital and for giving everybody on the line the opportunity to hear your thoughts in, let's say, a slightly longer form sort of way. So thank you again for all of the insights you've provided us and for giving us a chance to go back and forth and just kind of see your perspective on the world.
Sure, my pleasure. I hope some of that was informative.
Absolutely, it was. And thank you to our audience, and everyone have a good afternoon.
Okay, I'm gonna go have a piece of Mashable birthday cake now. Thanks.
Have a good one.